The fifth position, the introduction of an alternative explanation for the end of war, more than any one of the other positions, makes visible the two-directional habit of believing and disbelieving in the power of enforcement phenomenon simultaneously. By far the most frequently singled out alternative is the morale or moral. The two are usually conflated element. Up to this point, we have been saying that injuring is the activity that designates a winner and a loser but not one that carries the power of its own enforcement, and thus one not having a differentiating attribute making it preferable to another contest. But now, with the introduction of the argument that victory is determined by morale, the activity of injuring is no longer credited with even having performed the work of designating a winner and a loser, thus all the more reason to have displaced the activity of injuring from the very start with some benign activity, though remarkably enough this is never a conclusion drawn by exponents of the morale position. In victory, the ratio of moral to physical factors, goes Napoleon's famous dictum, is 3-to-1, a claim which, especially among military ratings, is widely accepted in its general outlines, even if the actual ratio is often moderated downward or at other moments upward. As in Field Marshal Montgomery's assessment, I consider morale the greatest and only factor in way /10 degree, though no one can doubt that there will be required of soldiers both those who will eventually be named among the losers and those who will be named among the winners unthinkable strength, courage, camaraderie, alertness, self-sacrifice, pride, exhilaration, a whole array of genuinely spirited and spiritual attributes, and though no one can doubt that these attributes and the general level of self-belief among soldiers can vary considerably, these two acknowledgments are not the same as the much more problem-laden assertion that victory belongs to, reveals, the side with the superior morale. There are four bases on which this assertion is objectionable, the last of which is the most important to the present analysis. Its invocation is, first of all, uneven, inconsistent. It tends to be invoked by military historians or political rhetoricians on the winning side, not on the losing side, and is almost never flanked by a series of parallel instances that would quickly expose the tawdriness of the translation of physical prowess into morale, and, worst of all, morality. Although, for example, it is theoretically conceivable that in the first half of the 1940s the Allied spirit may have been morally superior to the spirit of the German people, one would only want to say that the Allied military victory itself was an objectification of a discrepancy in morale or moral character if one were willing to cite Germany's rapid victory over Poland, its quick forcing of the capitulation of France, and its almost uncontested imprisonment of Jews as a manifestation of its superiority over these three populations in the element of morale, an interpretation that Hitler, at that moment the victor, would have cheerfully accepted. Similarly, to identify the end of the American Civil War as an objectification of the stronger morale or moral character of the Union troops would then oblige one to identify the original subjugation of blacks in the South as a manifestation of the superiority of white morale, again an interpretation that Southern pro-slavery leaders would have accepted. This is not to say that the moral character of the North was not superior, for on at least one overwhelmingly important issue it was. It is to say that military victory is neither the proof nor the sign of that supremacy. In war as in peace, the seductiveness of physical and political power is in nothing so apparent as in its ability to oblige observers to rescribe it as a moral superiority. As problematic as, and implied by, its inconsistent invocation is the second basis, its own internal characteristics. Even if one were successfully able to hold separate the connotations of morale and moral and claim only the former, since the two may be irrelevant to one another and may even work at cross purposes, for example, the single-minded sense of self-rightness entailed in high morale is likely to be diminished by elements of moral character, the introspective contemplation of the relative merits of the two sides or of the virtue of the acts one is, during war, participating in, the notion of asterisk. Morale still tends to have an aura of the spiritual, to signal some capacity for self-transcendence or form of consciousness different from the physical events. The most familiar formulations, such as Napoleon's, tend to single it out as something separable from and even poised against physical acts. But if one were to watch the final hours of a battle, both groups of men exhausted from their unbroken 36-hour confrontation, themselves hungry, some wounded, almost all in the acute state of loss that will come from having seen in recent hours the maiming of comrades whose dead bodies may still lie nearby, and if the one group of men were visibly able to carry on more than the other, the superiority would be most factually or literally described as this, the ability to go on injuring, even when you are yourself badly injured. Although it might be that one would want to be able to do this, but this is not separable from the activity of injuring but is a name for the sustained capacity to injure. Nor does it seem to have the aura of self-transcend. Hence, the capacity to live beyond, to produce work that is itself free of, the pressures and terrors of the body that one might attribute to a person able to nurse another despite the fact that he was himself in great pain, or to a person able to go on composing music even when he or she lost the ability to hear, or more simply to people carrying out the events of everyday life despite losses to their own bodies or those of members of their families. 101. A third basis on which it is an objectionable form of explanation is the apparent freedom of the claim from any requirement for evidence. Although military reports from the front, especially those requesting reinforcements or a change in plan, will include descriptions of morale, the assertion that the final outcome was determined by morale is not ordinarily accompanied by a comparison of eyewitness accounts of morale on the two sides. 102. In fact, what tends to be cited as evidence is the lack of any physical event, such as a wide discrepancy in the margin of deaths on the two sides, that could explain how it is that one side 1. The invocation of morale as the winning determinant is an enduring instance of circular reasoning. Its active presence is inferred from the presence of a victory coupled with the absence of any other visible locus of victory. The fourth and most important basis of objection is structural. 103. If morale is taken as a shorthand summation of an army's injuring capacity, its invocation as an explanation does not create any special problem in the structural logic of war, but if it is asserted as something separate, and as something appropriately conflated with morality, then it creates a self-refuting structure in which the act of belief-disbelief is now built into war's very form. In order to visualize what occurs in this explanation, the diffuse attribute of morale can be translated into an activity. It is spoken about as separate from injuring, and picturing it as a discrete activity makes it possible to hold steadily visible the asserted fact of that separation. Because morale has connotations of the human spirit, the capacity to live beyond the body, the capacity to dwell in the realm of symbols and substitutes rather than the raw physical events of survival, it is at least as often associated with world building as with world destroying, with creating as with killing, and thus can be taken to reside in the other benign activities invoked earlier, the composition of music, singing, nursing, house building, chess playing, or 100 others, and can be represented by any one of them, say singing. When war is described as turning in its final stage on the element of morale, separable from injuring, what is drawn is a model of war constructed along the lines in the following narrative. A dispute arises between two populations. In order to determine a winner, they agree to have a contest. They could have either an extravagant 3-year-long song contest or instead a 3-year-long war. They choose the second because, though each would allow the designation of a winner and a loser, injuring unlike singing will carry the power of its own enforcement. But after moving through 3 autumns, 3 winters, 3 springs, and 2 summers during which they butcher one another, if the word is ugly, the acts it represents are far uglier, they begin to approach the 3rd summer, and they realize that not only will injuring not carry the power of its own enforcement, but it will not even make possible the distinction between the winner and the loser. Despite fluctuations, the body count on each side tends to approximate that on the other side, and thus to continually re-establish the equality of the 2 sides rather than to expose their inequality. Thus here, at the end of war, at the very place where the exceptional virtue or the exceptional contribution of injuring was to have occurred, and for the sake of which injuring was chosen over any alternative, it is suddenly necessary to make arrangements for the insertion of the song contest into the overarching frame of war. Like an architectural detail from one period appropriated into the building of another period, it becomes the portal through which the final exit out of war will occur. This is the equivalent of the morale argument, the acceptance of the brutalities of war. With the 11th hour insertion of the chess match or tennis match or talent contest contracted down into the period immediately preceding its ending, the abbreviated contest does not displace or provide a substitute for the injuries, for thousands of injuries have by this time already occurred and will continue to occur in the final weeks. It instead substitutes for the single element that was thought to necessitate and hence justify the injuring. The fragile song contest, which no one precisely saw, though everywhere here and there it is said voices were heard, is like a small jewel placed down in the midst of a 3-year massacre and relied on to perform the very work for the sake of which its own activity had been originally rejected. Thus, the 5th position, the alternative description of war's ending, is especially when placed in the company of the other 4 important as a manifestation of our collective capacity at once to believe in and to doubt the power of enforcement phenomenon, which appears not to be the answer to the central question raised here and leaves us back at that original question. The conclusions that emerge when war is compared with other contests may appear to go in contradictory directions. On the one hand, war continues to have no analog and hence to be undisplaceable, neither vastly magnifying some other benign contest to the scale of war nor contracting the arena of injuring down to the familiar scale of peacetime contests, the 2 most available paths of substitution, replicates the outcome of war. On the other hand, what differentiates it from potential substitutes remains elusive, since it seemed only to perform the work of designating a winner and a loser, and not a loser incapable of performing the activity by which the issue might be recontested. But there is less of a contradiction than there might at first appear, for the differentiating characteristic, the fact that the losers and winners abide by the outcome of those designations to an extent that they would not in any other contest, has not been called into question. All that has been questioned is the account of that outcome as happening through the power of enforcement principle, the explanation AC. According to which the losers abide because they have no choice. It is not that they abide, but that they are compelled to abide, that is untrue. Furthermore, although the power of enforcement principle is not at work in the way that it is widely believed to be, the very fact that it is widely believed to be at work may be in the end the occurrence that lets it work. If populations, whether out of shared opinion, self-conscious judgment, or on self-reflecting impulse and intuition, assume this to be the case, it will be the case not because it had to be, but because it was believed it had to be. The outcome of war endures long beyond the temporal moment and is translated into the disposition of issues because it is believed to and hence allowed to carry the power of its own enforcement. Though the principle does not in itself literally exist, its effect is just as literally brought into existence by its being assumed, unquestioned, if questioned reaffirmed, and most importantly, acted upon. Thus, the question that confronts us is not how does injuring, once extended from 2 figures to 2 multitudes of figures, create an incontestable outcome, but how does it or why does it give rise to the fiction that its outcome cannot be, or should not, or must not be, contested. Whether there is a wide or a narrow margin of victory, once the war ends it will be as though war carried the power of its own enforcement, and it is as though mechanism, they as if reflex, that may at last expose the terrifying resources of war as 2 populations assume their respective designations as winner and loser, pass over the final boundary, and stand on the narrow piece of terrain that separates the activity of world destroying that has just ended from the activity of world rebuilding that is about to begin. This as it function is the subject of the next section. For the end of one, the laying edge to edge of injured bodies and unanchored issues. The extent to which in ordinary peacetime activity the nation-state resides unnoticed in the intricate recesses of personhood, penetrates the deepest layers of consciousness, and manifests itself in the body itself is hard to assess, for it seems at any given moment hardly there, yet seems at many moments, however hardly, there in the metabolic mysteries of the body's hunger for culturally stipulated forms of food and drink, the external objects one is willing habitually to put into oneself, hardly there but there in the learned postures, gestures, gait, the ease or reluctance with which it breaks into a smile, there in the regional accent, the disposition of the tongue, mouth, and throat, the elaborate and intricate play of small muscles that may also be echoed and magnified throughout the whole body, as when a man moves across the room, there radiates across his shoulder, head, hips, legs, and arms the history of his early boyhood years of life in Georgia and his young adolescence in Manhattan. The presence of learned culture in the body is sometimes described as an imposition originating from without. The words polis and polite are, as Pierre Bourdieu reminds us, etymologically related, and the concessions of politeness always contain political concessions 104, but it must at least in part be seen as originating in the body, attributed to the refusal of the body to disown its own early circumstances, its mute and often beautiful insistence on absorbing into its rhythms and postures the signs that it inhabits a particular space at a particular time. The human animal is in its early years civilized, learns to stand upright, to walk, to wave and signal, to listen, to speak, and the general civilizing process takes place within particular civil realms, a particular hemisphere, a particular nation, a particular state, a particular region. Whether the body's loyalty to these political realms is more accurately identified as residing in one fragile gesture or in 1,000, it is likely to be deeply and permanently there, more permanently there, less easily shed, than those disembodied forms of patriotism that exist in verbal habits or in thoughts about one's national identity. The political identity of the body is usually learned unconsciously, effortlessly, and very early it is said that within a few months of life British infants have learned to hold their eyebrows in a raised position. So, too, it may be the last form of patriotism to be lost. Studies of 3rd and 4th generation immigrants in the United States show that long after all other cultural habits, language, narratives, celebrations of festival days, have been lost or disowned, culturally stipulated expressions of physical pain remain and differentiate Irish American, Jewish American, or Italian American. 105. What is remembered in the body is well remembered. When a 15-year-old girl climbs off her bike and climbs back on at 25, it may seem only the 10-year carrot interval that her body has forgotten, so effortless is the return to mastery her body, however slender, hovering wide over the thin silver spin of the narrow wheels. So, too, her fingers placed down on piano keys may recover a lost song that was not available to her auditory memory and seem to come into being in her fingertips themselves, coming out of them after the first 2 or 3 faltering notes with ease, as though it were only another form of breathing. Even these nearly apolitical examples are not wholly apolitical, for at the very least there is registered in her body the fact that she lives in a culturally stipulated time, after the invention of bicycles and pianos, and place, a land where these objects are available to the general population rather than to the elite alone, for she is not a princess. Someone from an earlier century or from a country without material objects might think, hearing the description of a girl gliding over the ground on round wings, her fingers fanning into ivory shafts that make music as they move, that it was an angel or a goddess that was being described. There exist, of course, forms of bodily memory that are anterior to, deeper than, and in ordinary peacetime contexts beyond the reach of culture. The body's self-immunizing antibody system is sometimes described as a memory system. The body, having once encountered certain foreign bodies, will the next time recognize, remember, and release its own defenses. So, too, within genetic research, the DNA and RNA mechanisms for self-replication are together understood as a form of bodily memory. 106. What is remembered in the body is well remembered. It is not possible to compel a person to unlearn the riding of a bike, or to take out the knowledge of a song residing in the fingertips, or to undo the memory of antibodies or self-replication without directly entering, altering, injuring the body itself. 107. So, too, the political identity of the body is not easily changed. If another flag is placed in front of British eyes, it will be looked at or looked away from with eyes looking out from under eyebrows held high. To the extent that the body is political, it tends to be unalterably political and thus acquires an apparent apolitical character precisely by being unsusceptible to, beyond the reach of, any new political imposition. 108. It is not surprising, for example, that China's national birth control goals have not been easily accepted, embodied, by the residents of Guangdong province, where the 7,000-year-old feudal philosophy of childbearing often makes ineffective the verbal advocacy of one child to a couple, even after 10 visits, 20 visits, or 100 visits to the couple from family planners, as well as pledge programs, the promise of bonuses to couples who comply, and the threat of forms of deprivation to erring couples, such as taking away a sewing machine or other important tool from the family household. 109. If a new political philosophy is to be absorbed by a country's population, it is best introduced to those who have not yet absorbed the old philosophy. That is, it is most easily learned by the country's children, whether the shift is in the direction of radical justice, the teaching of racial equality to United States children through school integration 110, or instead in the direction of radical injustice, the teaching of racial hatred to German children in the Hitler Youth Corps. As Borty writes of even the passing on of cultural matters from one generation to the next, the principles embodied in this way are placed beyond the grasp of consciousness, and hence cannot be touched by voluntary, deliberate transformation, cannot even be made explicit. Nothing seems more ineffable, more incommunicable, more inimitable, and therefore, more precious, than the values giver body, made body by the transubstantiation achieved by the hidden pedagogy, capable of instilling a whole cosmology, an ethic, a metaphysic, a political philosophy, through injunctions as insignificant as stand up straight or don't hold your knife in your left hand. And of the many things that might be said about the nature of injury in war, a small number may begin to lead to an explanation for the overarching question that confronts us here, the question of how injuring creates an abiding outcome, an outcome that is as though the losers were deprived of the capacity to renew the activity of injuring, even though in almost no case is the losing side actually placed in that position. First, it is not the case that the body is normally apolitical and only becomes political at the moment of war. Not only is a specific culture absorbed at an early age by those dwelling within its boundaries, but, particularly, if there is no change in political philosophy, the nation-state will without notice continue to interact on a day-to-day basis with its always embodied citizens. It might even be argued that the attributes of a particular political philosophy, its generosities and its failures, are most apparent in those places where it intersects with, touches or agrees not to touch, the human body. In the medical system it formally or informally sponsors that determines whose body will and whose body will not be repaired, in the guarantees it provides or refuses to provide about the quality and consistency of foods and drugs that will enter the body, in the system of laws that identify the personal acts toward another's body that the state will designate unpolitical, unsocial, uncivil, illegal, criminal, and that will thus occasion the direct imposition of the state on the offender's body and the separation of that unpolitical or uncivil presence from contact with the citizens. It may be that the degree to which body and state are interwoven with one another can be most quickly appreciated by noticing the most obvious and ongoing manifestation of that relation, such as the fact that one's citizenship ordinarily entails physical presence within the boundaries of that country, a relation between body and state that can be overlooked by being too obvious. Or it may instead be that it can best be appreciated by noticing almost random instances of the intricate and specific locations of contact between them. In the United States law of torts, for example, rulings about product liability first began with objects that entered the human body, food, drink, or were directly applied to the body's surface, cosmetics, soap, before being extended to objects in less immediate relation to the body, the container for the food, the lights in a shopping market parking lot there to assure vision and visibility to the shoppers. Point 112. In United States criminal law, people accused of committing crimes cannot be compelled to incriminate themselves verbally, but can be compelled to incriminate themselves physically, to be physically present for identification in the courtroom, for example, or to provide a sample of blood or hair that may match fragments of these substances found near the person. 113. In United States constitutional law, again to take only one specific example, cases in which the Supreme Court has invoked the right of privacy have tended to be on subjects directly connected to the human body, issues of conception, contraception, definition of generational relations, rather than issues of psychology, religion, or profession. 114. A specific and intricate interaction of body and state would have equivalents in any nation. It is precisely because political learning is, even in peacetime, deeply embodied that the alteration of the political configuration of a country, continent, or hemisphere so often appears to require the alteration of human bodies through war. But the fact that the human body is political in peace as well as in war, and here we arrive at a second, more important point, does not mean that the body-state relation is in the two conditions continuous. The nature of that relation in ordinary life, far from normalizing what occurs in war, makes compellingly visible by contrast the exceptional nature of going to war. What is first of all visible is the extremity with which, or the extreme literalness with which, the nation inscribes itself in the body, or, to phrase it in a way that acknowledges the extraordinary fact of the consent of the participating populations in conventional war, the literalness with which the human body opens itself and allows the nation to be registered there in the wound. While in peacetime a person may literally absorb the political reality of the state into his body by lifting his eyebrows by altering for the sake of and in unself-conscious recognition of his membership in the larger political community the reflex of a small set of muscles. In his forehead now in war he is agreeing by entering a certain terrain and participating in certain acts to the tearing out of his forehead, eyebrows, and eyes. That is, though in peace and in war his existence as a political being entails, not simply disembodied beliefs, thoughts, ideas but also, actual physical self-alteration, the form and degree of alteration are incomparable, as is the temporal duration of the alteration. The nation may ordinarily be registered in his limbs in a particular kind of handshake or salutation performed for a few seconds each day, or absorbed into his legs and back in a regional dance performed several days each year, but the same arms and legs lent out to the state for seconds or minutes and then reclaimed may in war be permanently loaned in injured and amputated limbs. That the adult human being cannot ordinarily without his consent be physically altered by the verbal imposition of any new political philosophy makes all the more remarkable, genuinely awesome, the fact that he sometimes agrees to go to war, agrees to permit this radical self-alteration to his body. Even in the midst of the collective savagery and stupidity of war, the idiom of heroism, sacrifice, dedication, devotion, and bravery conventionally invoked to describe the soldier's individual act of consent over his own body is neither inappropriate nor false. The answer to the question about the duration of the outcome of war in part resides in the duration of the contest activity. What is remembered in the body is well remembered. The bodies of massive numbers of participants are deeply altered, those new alterations are carried forward into peace. So, for example, the history of the United States' participation in numerous 20th century wars may be quietly displayed across the surviving generations of any American family. A grandfather whose distorted feet permanently memorialize the location and landing site of a piece of shrapnel in France, the feet to which there will always cling the narration of a difficult walk over fields of corn stubble, a father whose heart became an unreliable penny whistle because of the rheumatic fever that swept through an army training camp in 1942, at once exempting him from combat and making him lethally vulnerable to the Asian flu that would kill him several decades later, a cousin whose damaged hip and permanent limp announce in each step the inflection of the word Vietnam, and along with the injuries of thousands of his peers assures that whether or not it is verbally memorialized, the record of war survives in the bodies, both alive and buried, of the people who were hurt there. If the war involves a country's total population or its terrain, the history may be more widely self-announcing. Berlin, Orange and Tawny City, bright, modern, architecturally new, confesses its earlier devastation in the very newness necessitated by that devastation, and in the temporal discrepancy between its front avenues where it is strikingly today, 1960, 70, now 85, and the courtyards immediately behind these buildings where time, as though held in place by the still unrepaired bullet holes, seems to have stopped at 1945. Berlin, bombed from above and taken block by block. Or again Paris, architecturally ancient, silver white and violet blue, announces in the very integrity of its old streets and buildings, their stately exteriors undisturbed by war except by the occasional insertion here and there of a plaque. To a fallen member of the resistance, its survival, its capitulation, just as the very different history of World War I, in which 2 out of every 3 young Frenchmen either died or lost a limb, is still visible in all the windows of the subway cars. Lay places number pound pound ESSONTR pound sur 6 ESPAR priority IPO. Mudilks de guerre. An inscription that each day runs beneath the standing city as though in counterpoint to and partial explanation for that later story recorded above. The physical signs cited here are those that survive the physical activity that produced them by 10 years, 40 years, 60 years. They only suggest in ghostly outline how deep, how daily, how massive is a population's experience of the residues of war in its immediate aftermath, the first 2 years, the first 4 months, when the survivors are immersed, engulfed, in those signs. This immediate period the war has just been declared over, the designations of winner and loser have just been received, the terms of peace and the disposition of post-war issues are in the process of being negotiated and accepted and acted on. JS what we are here trying to understand. There are, to return to a point arrived at earlier in the discussion, 3 arenas of damage in war, 3 arenas of alteration. First, embodied persons. Second, the material culture or self-extension of persons. Third, immaterial culture, aspects of national consciousness, political belief, and self-definition. The object in war, as in any imaginable surrogate contest through which an international dispute was to be settled, is the third, for it is the national self-definitions of the disputing countries that have collided, and the dispute disappears if at least one of them agrees to retract, relinquish, or alter its own form of self-belief, its own form of self-extension. In war, the first and second forms of damage are the means for determining which of the 2 sides will undergo the third form of damage. Both sides will suffer the first and second kinds of damage, but only one will undergo the third, and it is the designation of winner and loser that determines which side will undergo that change in the third arena. But, in addition, once the war is declared over, the first and second arenas of damage function as an abiding record of the third, surviving long after the day on which the injuring contest ended, objectifying the fact that such a contest occurred, that there was a war, that there was a winner and a loser. It is crucial to notice here that the damage does not objectify or specify who was the winner and who was the loser, but only that there was a war, that there was a winner and a loser. The very endurance of the record partly explains why the outcome is abided by. That is, it is not that injuring provides an outcome that cannot itself then be contested. Not only are there on the losing side many persons who though wounded are still capable of holding a gun, but in addition, their siblings, 13, 14, or 15 years old when the war first began, are now 18, 19, or 20. The population of soldiers, even in the midst of devastation, renews itself. But once the end is agreed to, that the war occurred and that the cessation of its occurrence was agreed to are etched into their bodies and their material culture. In the hypothetical, surrogate contest invoked earlier, nothing performed the parallel act of memorialization. If one were to imagine substituting for war the massive and extended form of a tennis contest, it would be necessary as well to provide a vehicle of memorialization. It would not be enough to build a miniature of a tennis court, or, if a weaving contest, a loom, in the town green of every city or village in each of the 2 countries, for that would only be the equivalent of war statues and placards conventionally placed in town greens and not the equivalent of the sentient memorialization in the damaged bodies and the continuously experienceable memorialization in the land. There would need to be a record in the more immediate and intimate vicinity of the body, such as a blue thread worn around the upper arm of all participants for a period of 8 years. It would be a fragile visible presence, barely noticed but in its constant light. Pressure against the skin, unalterably there. The thread would be blue for winners and losers alike, for again physical damage in war memorializes without specifying. It is not, after a war, as though the winners are alive and the losers are dead, nor as though the winners are alive and uninjured and the losers alive but injured, nor as though the injured winners all lost a leg and the injured losers a hand or a knot. Thus any surrogate form of objectification should also be constant across the 2 populations, only certifying that a process entailing the performance of a reciprocal assistivity for a non-reciprocal outcome took place. Or, rather than a thread. The memory of the resolution process could be absorbed into and objectified by a small bodily ch2 incorporated into daily life. All persons in the two populations could learn to turn their instep out immediately before beginning to walk and again immediately before stopping the walk. The gesture would become habitual and would be unself-consciously carried forward into peacetime activities, noticed only now and then but steadily accompanying them in all their renewed work of world building. These imagined signs, the fragile blue thread or the small arc of an outward kick, are obviously inadequate equivalents for the signs of war, but they may by their very inadequacy work to illuminate the nature of the wounds for which they are poor substitutes and thus one day suggest what an adequate equivalent would be, a substitute at once benign and compelling. They are therefore not lightly invoked here, for if it is awkward, even embarrassing, to contemplate such substitutions, how much more humanly awkward it is not to notice that the single advantage war has over other contests is that its outcome is abided by, that injuring works in part through the abiding signs it produces, or how much more awkward, humanly embarrassing, would it be, having recognized that war's outcome holds through the process of memorialization, to fail to search for or invent a set of signs that would perform the same work in its place. It is not only war's horrifying inner activity of injuring and being injured that is consented to, but its end, its being over, that is consented to, and it is the human capacity for consent, for making contracts, pledges, promises, processes that have outcomes that are then, as though physically necessary, abided by, and in particular the way in which that capacity for making promises or outcomes that will be abided by is assisted by the nature of injury that has been our implicit subject from the start, and will be the wholly explicit subject of the discussion with which this chapter now ends. Point 115. The characteristic of injuring noted in passing above that the injuries memorialized without specifying winner or loser must be attended to more closely, for the nature of injuring in war is remarkable not only for the extremity and endurance of the relation between body and belief, but simultaneously for the complete fluidity of referential direction. This third characteristic of injuring is perhaps the most crucial in understanding the working of the resolution of war. Injuring, the contest activity, has no relation to the contested issues. If the wounded bodies of a Union and a Confederate soldier were placed side by side during the American Civil War, nothing in those wounds themselves would indicate the different political beliefs of the two sides, as in World War II there would not be anything in the three bodies of a wounded Russian soldier, a Jewish prisoner from a concentration camp, a civilian who had been on the street in Hiroshima, to differentiate the character of the issues on the Allied and Axis sides. But neither would those injuries make visible who had won and who had lost. In the instances invoked earlier, nothing in the distorted bones of the American grandfather's feet and the American cousin's hip shows that the United States was on the winning side in World War I while on the losing side in Vietnam. Again, the wounds in the bodies of a generation of Frenchmen or the visible damage in the streets of Berlin do not indicate whether France won or lost in 1918, whether Germany won or lost in 1945. Again, there is nothing in the craters of the terrain of Vietnam that signals the locus of victory. In each case, all that is indicated is that there was a war, that there was the reciprocal activity of injuring for a non-reciprocal outcome. The activity of injuring in war has, then, two separable functions. It is the activity by means of which a winner and a loser are arrived at. It also, after the war, provides a record of its own activity. In the first of these two functions the injuries are referential. It very much matters to which of the two sides injuries and damage occurred, and thus the disputing nations and watching world will attend to the kill ratios 116. However, in the second function, the location of the injuries will cease to be dual and will collectively substantiate that the war occurred and is now over. The difference in the direction of referentiality in the two functions can be seen by looking at the different place that casualties have during a conflict and after that conflict. If in the midst of the American Civil War, one learns that a battle is occurring in which there are so far 20,000 casualties, it will very much matter to know whether the North has lost 2,000 and the South 18,000, or instead the South has lost 2,000 and the North 18,000, or instead that North and South have each lost 10,000. Such differences will determine who is victorious in the battle, and over the various battles will eventually help to determine which of the two out-injures 117 the other, and thus, which of the two is winner and which is loser. But once those final labels are designated and the war is over, it will cease to matter how the casualties in that battle, or in the war as a whole, were distributed, and all 20,000, whether originally suffered very unequally or almost equally, will now substantiate the winner and winning issues or, to phrase it in an almost equally accurate way, will collectively substantiate the non-existence or disappearance of the losing issue. Late in the Civil War, a Southern family might say, the autonomy of the South, the survival of its economic and racial ideas, is crucial to us. 94,000 have died in substantiation of that importance, or a family in the North might say, the unity of the country. The supremacy of the industrial North and its beliefs about human justice are crucial. The cost of those beliefs is the lives of 110,000 of our lads. But once the war is over, these verbal constructions will tend to be replaced by one in which the casualties not now 94,000 and 110,000 but 204,000, or 534,000 if including death from disease, collectively substantiate, or are perceived as the cost of a single outcome. Racial justice and national unity were to be crucial to the United States as a nation. 534,000 died in the Civil War, or the young America was maimed by the slavery of which it was necessary to rid itself violently. 534,000 died in the Civil War. Thus a Southern boy who may have believed himself to be risking and inflicting wounds for a feudal system of agriculture, and until the end of the war will have suffered much hardship and finally death for those beliefs, will once the war is over have died in substantiation of the disappearance of that feudal system and the racial inequality on which it depended. The fluidity of the injured body's referential direction is here manifest in the verbal habit of invoking all casualties as a single phenomenon once the war is over. A second and kindred verbal habit is to keep the injuries of the two sides separate, but to cite those that occurred to one side either to make manifest the fact that that side won or to make manifest the fact that they lost. That is, juxtaposed to the assertion that a country won or lost is the assertion of the number of injuries that occurred, showing that injuries are perceived to be demonstrable proof of either victory or defeat. They won, 10,000 died there, and they lost, 10,000 died there, are constructions appearing with almost equal frequency, as in the two sentences, the Russians lost the Battle of Tannenberg, 30,000 Russians died there, and it was the Russians who won it. Second Great War with Germany, 20 million Russians died in World War II. These sentences do not cancel each other out, both are meaningful statements, but the special character of injury is indicated by the fact that it can be perceived as, and thus invoked as, substantiating disparate phenomena, even phenomena so disparate that they are opposites, as with winning and losing. Both the citation of the collective deaths as a single reality and the citation of one side's death as certification of either its victory or its defeat arise because of the referential instability of the body that allows it to confer its reality on whatever outcome occurred. It may be in part precisely because once the war has ended the physical alterations no longer belong to two sides but seem to belong to neither or both simultaneously, that the erroneous idea can arise that injury was not, during the war, the central activity, or that it had nothing central to do with determining a winner and a loser, and thus comes in descriptions of war to be unrepresented, as in the categories of omission and redescription looked at earlier, or misrepresented, as in the metaphors of byproduct, accidental entailment, receding cost, or extension of an innocent activity. Thus the body's relation to political belief in war is not only much more extreme and enduring, and thus more substantial, more intensely and experienceably real, than it is in peace, but it also differs, and this attribute of injuring is as responsible as the other for the as if phenomenon that occurs at the end of war by being much less culturally specific. Although, for example, the self-alteration that occurs when a person gives his eyes and for it for his country is much more extreme than what occurs when he unself-consciously raises his eyebrows for his country. It is in its interior content much emptier of any reference to that country. It is not more British than Greek or American or Russian in a way that holding those eyebrows in a certain habitual position is more British than Greek, American, or Russian. Although the referential instability of the body reaches an extreme in injuring, it characterizes even the uninjured body in war. In his study of the technological changes in warfare over the course of civilization, for example, William McNeill finds the creation of the modern army in the 17th century as remarkable in its way as the birth of science or any other breakthrough of that age. 118 and lists as a major effect of drill the rhythmic movement of marching in step with many men or of firing a gun by following a precise series of 42 successive acts performed identically by all participants. The disappearance from the soldier's body of the signs of a particular region or country, the psychic force of drill and new routines was such as to make a recruit's origins and previous experience largely irrelevant to his behavior as a soldier. 119 Such drills and routines, like fundamental strategic concepts 120 tend to become international and thus to become shared by the two nations in any war. This same emptying of the body of cultural content is even more true of injury, for there is nothing in the interior of what had been a boy's face, nothing in the open interior of what had been a torso, that makes the wound North Korean, German, Argentinian, Israeli. Though a moment before he was blown apart he himself had a national identity that was Chinese, British, American, or Russian, the exposed bones and lungs and blood do not now fall into the shape of 5 yellow stars on a red field, nor into the configuration of the Union Jack, nor the stars and stripes, nor the hammer and sickle, nor is there written there the first line of some national hymn, though he might have, up to a moment ago, been steadily singing it. Only alive did he sing, that is, only alive did he determine and control the referential direction of his body, did he determine the ideas and beliefs mad would be substantiated by his own embodied person and presence. The wound is empty of reference, though its intended referent can be inferred by the uniform over which the blood now falls, or by some other cultural insignia, a symbol and fragment of disembodied national identification. At this moment, the extremes of body, the always embodied body, and culture, the usually partially embodied and partially disembodied but now wholly disembodied forms of self-extension, the extremes of body and polis, the extremes of sentience and self-extension, are made to have something to do with one another by sheer proximity, the proximity not of body and ground, for he may be an Iranian on the terrain of Iraq, an American in North Korea, but of body and uniform, body and flag, or body. And verbal assertion as when a comrade finds him in the brush, kneels beside him, and locating some fragment of identification, announces to those who stand nearby * he is American. But when the referential direction is determined by proximity or juxtaposition, what is proximate, what is juxtaposed, can be changed, a different symbolic counterpart or cultural fragment can be placed beside the wound whose compelling reality may now work on behalf of a different constellation of beliefs clinging to that new fragment. This shift explicitly happens when the enemy hears of his death and reads it not as a death but as a successful kill, reads it as belonging to their side, substantiating their cause. One may wish to think that the wound is specifically trenched because it resides in the body of a front boy, but it is the nature of injury that its attributes can be lifted away from the site, as though the wound in the chest were the severing of that tissue's relation with the rest of the body. If from that wound he dies, his whole body is deeply affected, radically altered, his whole body is now the wound. Does this dead boy's body belong to his side, the side for which he died, or does it belong to the side for which someone killed him, the side that took him? That it belongs to both or neither makes manifest the non-referential character of the dead body that which will become operative in war's aftermath, a non-referentiality that rather than eliminating all referential activity instead gives it a frightening freedom of referential activity, one whose direction is no longer limited and controlled by the original contexts of personhood and motive, thus increasing the directions in which at the end of the war it can now move. If the wounded boy lives, the intensely real pain in his chest may for a time preoccupy all his attention and thus eclipse his beliefs, but it may, as he begins to recover, recertify those beliefs, bestow its intense reality on those convictions. So, too, if he dies, the compelling spectacle of the open body may confer its compelling character on the political beliefs or national allegiance of the comrades who find him. They may, as they look with horror at what the opponents have done to his flesh, feel with renewed vividness their commitment to their task. So, too, his death perhaps coupled with many others in a single figure may when contemplated by the enemy, revivify their own self-belief. 10 Brits died in the explosion. Long live Ireland. All of Dresden is burning. Long live the Allied cause. The extremes of body and culture are still being placed side by side in these sentences, as originally they were placed side by side in the blood that fell across the uniform. The fluidity of reference in the solitary wounded boy's experience or in others' experience of the solitary boy becomes most apparent in its overall occurrence, as in the earlier example of the collective casualties from the Civil War substantiating a single outcome. This would be equally true of any other war. The 50 million deaths of World War II after the war substantiate the outcomes determined by the winners rather than half of them substantiating the only ones wished for issues or once believed in beliefs of the loser. 121 Together they confirm the abiding reality of one set of issues and the disappearance of another. So, too, in the midst of ongoing contemporary wars such as that between Iraq and Iran or between Israel and the Arab nations, the casualties belong to two sides, and their distribution and separate locations work to determine a winner and a loser. But when in their turn these wars, too, one day end, people from both sides will be coupled together in collective substantiation of the outcome. The attributes of injuring now partially visible should be placed within the frame of the overall analysis that will be briefly summarized here. Those attributes will then be themselves elaborated in more detail. The hurt body's instability of reference may be so unpleasant to contemplate, particularly since it denies the population's ability to ensure what finally will be confirmed by its own violent and physically costly display of will, that one may be tempted to insist that the function of injuring ceases once the contest ends. But this temptation must be avoided because its claim is untrue. If it were true, if injuring only worked to provide a means for designating a winner and a loser, any other contest activity could be substituted in its place, since any one of them is equally able to provide a means for deciding a winner and a loser. To argue that it only has the first function makes the collective human failure to provide a surrogate for war inexplicable, since its work could be so easily and benignly duplicated. But unlike injuring, the substitute activity would only provide designations and would not provide compelling, abiding designations that would be abided by. It would not provide an end to its own activity that was received as though it were itself incontrovertible, uncontestable. Thus the question is, how precisely does injuring do this? It does not, as has been stressed, do this by eliminating from the losing side the power to contest, but instead by providing an outcome that is as real as if, as absolute as if, as compelling as though the losers no longer had the power to contest, and it is the nature of the as if function that is being explored in this present section. The overarching frame of the discussion has, then, four central parts. The first and second are that injuring has two functions. The first function is to determine which population and set of disputed beliefs will be the winner, which population and set of disputed beliefs will be the loser. The second function is to substantiate whatever outcome was produced as a result of the first function. As it becomes clear that these are two very different, quite separable functions, it is possible to back up for a brief moment to the erroneous power of enforcement argument in which the defeated no longer have injury-inflicting capacity, and see that the error here is in assigning all the work of injury to the first of the two functions and wrongly believing that what differentiates injuring from any other contest activity is the completeness with which it establishes the categories of winner and loser, in effect pushing winners to mean alive and losers to mean dead. Injuring instead has a wholly distinct second function, which is to make the outcome produced by the first function seem absolute, seem real until there is time for the issues to be universally acted on and in this way made real. Injuries as signs point both backward and forward in time. On the one hand, they make perpetually visible an activity that is PTSD, and thus have a memorialization function asterisk. On the other hand, they refer forward to the future to what has not yet occurred, and thus have an as-if function. This might be called their fiction-generating or reality-conferring function, for they act as a source of apparent reality for what would otherwise be a tenuous outcome, holding it firmly in place until the post-war world rebuilds that world according to the blueprint sketchily specified by the war's locus of victory. That this function entails fictitiousness does not mean that it entails fraudulence. What it substantiates is not untrue, it is just NPT yet true. The work of the second, reality conferring function depends in turn on two attributes of injury, and it is these two attributes that are the third and fourth of the central conclusions here, the third and fourth elements of what is understood here to be war's essential structure. First, the visible and experienceable alteration of injury has a compelling and vivid reality because it resides in the human body, the original side of reality, and more specifically because of the extremity and endurance of the alteration. Second, this reality can be conferred on either set of disputed issues, OT as sometimes happens, a mixture of issues from the two sides, because of the non-specificity of reference, or the referential instability of the hurt body. Each of these two will be briefly elaborated below, so that the shape of the overall activity of war, as well as the shape of any potential substitute, will gradually become more clear. Referential instability. The non-referentiality of the hurt body, or the referential instability of the hurt body, for the two are a single phenomenon, can be understood by returning to the soldier's own universal declaration that he is going to die for his country or to kill for his country. By looking at the three phrases to die, to kill, and for my country, it will become clear that there is a deterioration of national reference in the first two that is then reclaimed by yoking each to the fifth phrase. The referential direction that is destroyed in dying and killing is then rescued or re-established by appending a direction in the phrase for the country. If at the end of war the person is on the losing side, his acts will not have substantiated the country specified in his original declaration of motive, and how this happens can best be understood by looking at that declaration of motive itself. To kill. It has often been observed that war is exceptional in human experience for sanctioning the act of killing, the act that all nations regard in peacetime as criminal. This accurate observation acknowledges that the act of killing, motivated by care for the nation, is a deconstruction of the state as it ordinarily manifests itself in the body. That is, in consenting to kill, he consents to perform, for the country, the act that would in peacetime expose his unpoliticalness and place him outside the moral space of the nation. What in killing he does is to range around his most fundamental sanctions about how within civilization, and this particular civilization, his country, another embodied person can be touched, he divests himself of civilization, decivilizes himself, reverses not just an idea or belief but a learned and deeply embodied set of physical impulses and gestures regarding his relation to any other person's body. He undoes the learning in his body as radically as he would if he were suddenly required to abandon the upright posture and move on four limbs as in his pre-civilized infancy. He consents to unmake himself, deconstruct himself, empty himself of civil content for his country. That this is actually done for his country is not being questioned here, and certainly it is not being made light of. All that is being said is that it is for his country, for civilization, for his country's version of civilization, is not visibly interior to the act itself, is not interior to the embodied gestures he performs. When during peacetime he touches gently his neighbor, or keeps a 5-inch space between himself and an acquaintance encountered on the street, one can see civilization inside the gestures and postures themselves, see it literally residing within him, as will be especially apparent if one then observes his restraint when he comes upon someone he deeply dislikes and avoids him rather than shattering him. He need not look up from any of these three acts and specify that this is for civilization, for to do so would be superfluous. Because his act of killing does not itself contain civilization in its interior, the fact that it is being done for a particular civilization, the referent for his act, is re-established and carried by the appended assertion, either verbalized or materialized as in the uniform, for my country. To die. The unmaking of the human being, the emptying of the nation from his body, is equally characteristic of dying or being wounded, for the in part naturally given and in part made body is deconstructed. When the Irishman's chest is shattered, when the Armenian boy is shot through the legs and groin, when a Russian woman dies in a burning village, when an American medic is blown apart on the field, their wounds are not Irish, Armenian, Russian, or American precisely because it is the unmaking of an Irishman, the unmaking of an Armenian boy, the unmaking of a Russian woman, the unmaking of an American soldier that has just occurred, as well as in each case the unmaking of the civilization resides in each of those bodies. The arms that had learned to gesture in a particular way are unmade, the hands that held within them not just blood and bone but the movements that made possible the playing of the piano unmade, the fingers and palms that knew in intricate detail the weight and feel of a particular tool are unmade, the feet that had within them by heart, that is, as a matter of deep bodily habit, the knowledge of how to pedal Bicycle are unmade. The head and arms and back and legs that contained within them an elaborate sequence of steps in a certain dance are unmade. All are deconstructed along with the tissue itself, the sentient source and site of all learning. Thus the roll call of death should always be taken as it was first taken by Homer in the record of war that stands at the beginning of Western civilization. Here each death, whether Trojan or Greek, comes before one's eyes in four aspects: the name of the person, the weapon, freighted with dark pains, as it approaches the body, the site of entry and the slow motion progress of the widening wound, for we are to understand that it is the deconstruction of sentient tissue that is taking place, and that this deconstruction always occurs along a specific path, and fourth and finally, one attribute of civilization as it is embodied in that person, or in that person's parent or comrade, for the capacity for parenting and camaraderie are themselves essential attributes of civilization. 122 each at. Tribute is invoked into the center of the wound, for each is implicated there and itself unmade, so the spear that cuts through the sinew of Peteus's head, passing through his teeth and severing his tongue, passes also through the work of good Lithiano who reared him carefully even as her own children, the bronze point that enters hurtless through the right buttock, pierces bladder and bone, and pierces as well the shipbuilding and craftsmanship body forth in the son of Tecton, Harmon's son. In the lethal fall of Axillus from his car is the fall of the well-built Arisbe, a home by the high road where entertainment was given to all. The huge jagged rock that cuts and crushes through the great souled head of Epicles cuts its way through his gradually shattered camaraderie with Sarpedon. 123 So, too, the 20th century litany of war deaths occurs in the same way. For the United States, the Vietnam War is not 57,000 names but names. Bodies, and embodied culture not Robert Dealray but Robert Dealray, from the left the artillery shell approached, entered his body and began its dark explosion, exploding there, too, the image of the standing crowd that each week watched his swift run across the playing fields of Chatham, not Manuel Font but Manuel Font, around his fragile frame the fire closed in, burning into his skin, and skull, and brain, burning even into the deep, shy corners where he studied at school. So the list would continue through tens of thousands of others. That the war deaths occurred on behalf of a terrain in which pianos could be played and bicycles could be pedaled, where schools would each day be entered by restrained and extravagantly gesturing children alike, must be indicated by AP pending the direction of motive, for my country, since the deaths themselves are the unmaking of the embodied terrain of pianos and bicycles, classmates, comrades, and schools. For my country. Thus to kill and to die or in the idiom that embraces both simultaneously, to her within one's own body, to hurt an opponent's body, or to alter body tissue are alike in having no interior. Referent and, if they are to have one, requiring a separate specification. But precisely because there is nothing interior that itself stipulates and in doing so limits us referent, the act of dying or killing can be lifted away and coupled with a different referent. What was for his country may at the end be for the opponent's country or for the post-war world cohabited by two countries and having certain characteristics, for example, boundaries, determined by one of the two more than by the other. That civilization is itself unmade is perhaps in nothing so evident as in the fact that the participants' national motives can be themselves deconstructed and replaced by outcomes deeply antagonistic to those motives. At the same time, however, it is clear that what the bodies of those slain in war ultimately substantiate will not, even if they were on the losing side, be contradictory to their original motives if by the motivational description, to kill and to die for my country, what was meant was to kill and to die in substantiation of my country's commitment to a process of resolving a dispute that requires of both sides the performance of a reciprocal activity and requires of both sides the acceptance of a non-reciprocal outcome. Thus if in the end the open bodies are juxtaposed to a country's right to a certain territory, whether that right is claimed to arise from a historical precedent, from an international rule, from the culture's idea of God, they will lend force and conviction to that. If they are juxtaposed to the idea of the international privilege of a colonizing power, they will substantiate that. If instead they are juxtaposed to the right of self-determination, they will substantiate that, and so forth. What is in each case substantiated is the structure of war itself that from the day on which it began required of both sides the performance of a single reciprocal activity and from the day on which it began was understood to require of both sides the acceptance of a non-reciprocal outcome. Reality conferring. Thus injuring in its second function is relied on as a form of legitimization because, though it lacks interior connections to the issues, wounding is able to open up a source of reality that can give the issue force and holding power. That is, the outcome of war has its substantiation not in an absolute inability of the defeated to contest the outcome but in a process of perception that allows extreme attributes of the body to be translated into another language, to be broken away from the body and relocated elsewhere at the very moment that the body itself is disowned, made to disappear along one of the six paths described earlier. The force of the material world is separated from the 57,000 or 50 million her bodies and conferred not only on issues and ideologies that have as a result of the first function been designated the winner, but also on the idea of winning itself. 124 The intricacies of the process of transfer that make it possible for the incontestable reality of the physical body to now become an attribute of an issue that at that moment has no independent reality of its own have already been looked at in their most radical and deconstructed form in torture, and will in later chapters be looked at in this very different and benign occurrence within civilization. What gradually becomes visible, by inversion in its deconstructed form in torture and war and straightforwardly in its undeconstructed civilized form, is the process by which a made world of culture acquires the characteristics of reality, the process of perception that allows invented ideas, beliefs, and made objects to be accepted and entered into as though they had the same ontological status as the naturally given world. Once the made world is in place, it will have acquired the legitimate forms of substantiation that are familiar to us. 125 That an invented thing is real will be ascertainable by the immediately apprehensible material fact of itself, the city, not the invisible city asserted to exist on the other side of the next sand dune, but one within the sensory horizon, has a materialized existence that is confirmable by vision, touch, hearing, smell. Its reality is accessible to all the senses. Its existence is thus confirmed within the bodies of the observers themselves. A made thing may instead not take a materialized and hence physically experienceable form. The idea of justice, a theory of gravity, a description of electricity, still that it is real or true will be certified by materialized or experienceable instances of it. Supporting facts, the theory of gravity cannot itself be seen but the falling apple can. But in the very earliest moments of invention, or when as in war there is a crisis of belief that suddenly carries a population back to the early stages because the world must be quickly reinvented, a disembodied idea that has no basis in the material world, either because its material form has not yet been discovered and thus it is not yet true, or because it can never have a material form since it is fundamentally untrue, can borrow the appearance of reality from the realm that from the very start has compelling reality to the human mind, the physical body itself. That is, instead of the familiar process of substantiation in which the observer certifies the existence of the thing by experiencing the thing in his own body, seeing it, touching it, the observer instead sees and touches the body of another person, or animal, juxtaposed to the disembodied idea, and having sensorially experienced the reality of the first, believes he or she has experienced the reality of the second. So, for example, a city, though invented, is real. A blueprint of a city is still experienceable through the senses but much less so than the built city, and thus is judged less real, is more immediately recognized as invented. But, finally, the city might exist only as a verbal assertion that on this very ground the city will next year exist. The prophet may, as he speaks these words, cut open the body and read in its entrails the exact date on which the city will appear. The coming of the city may be believed, received as compelling truth, because the open body has lent it its truth. So, too, an idea of God, or an explanation of lightning, or the asserted power of a ruler over the winds, could be juxtaposed to a body part that demonstrates or substantiates the truth of the assertion by having itself indisputable substance that somehow is read as belonging to its counterpart. It is as though the human mind, confronted by the open body itself, whether human or animal, does not have the option of failing to perceive its reality that rushes unstoppably across his eyes and into his mind, yet the mind so flees from what it sees that it will with almost equal speed perform the counter-movement of assigning that attribute to something else, especially if there is something else at hand made ready to receive the rejected attribute, ready to act as its referent. Why the body should, at a certain moment in the process of creation, have this frightening power of substantiation may for a time be unfathomable, but that it has this power can be demonstrated in many different contexts, some of which are ancient and some contemporary. Although for the time being it is only this phenomenon as it occurs in war that is being pointed to, it will be helpful to recall here the difference between this form of bodily translation and that form of bodily translation that is its antithesis and occurs benignly in civilization. 126 The two sometimes occur in the same cultural moment, and the difference can be seen there. For example, after sacrifice was no longer central to the Brahmin religion in India, it occasionally reoccurred because it was needed in order to make impregnable important points within the city. The body of the one slain in sacrifice was buried in the foundation of the crucial gate, bastion, or dam. 127 Though this act of sacrifice involves a translation of the material fact of the body into a disembodied cultural fiction, the assertion of impregnability, so does the building of the city itself. Basic attributes of the human body are projected in and protected by the finished arrangement of wall and gate. Further, the construction is literally brought into being by the body's outward translation of itself into artifact through labor. But the translation that occurs within the sacrifice differs from the other in three ways. First, it requires that someone be hurt. Second, there is a twisting of terms. The attribute of the body before the translation is the opposite of what the attribute is called after the translation, thus pain is relied on to project power, mortality to project immortality, vulnerability to project impregnability. Only insofar as the dead body and the impregnable gate both enjoy a form of non-sentience that places them beyond the reach of further hurt do they possess parallel attributes of invincibility. 128 Third, the translation is a shorthand version of what occurs in civilization. The extreme fact of the body, not some of its attributes, its rigidity and defensiveness in the case of the wall, or some of its power, such as the focusing of energy that occurs in work, but the body itself. The corpse is laid edge to edge with an extreme of sublimation, not a partially materialized and thus self-substantiating construction but a wholly verbal and disembodied assertion of impregnability. This third element, the laying edge to edge of the extremes of the material and the immaterial is, when separated from the first two, not necessarily negative. It recurs in many forms in primitive thought, as though the unmediated juxtaposition of body and voice is a rehearsal for or, as in the Indian city above, a commemoration of the capacity for self-transformation out of the privacy of the body into richly mediated forms of culture. It frequently appears, for example, in early forms of oaths, a form of implicit contract that is relevant to an understanding of war because war, like a pledge, entails the capacity to abide by a certain not yet substantiated outcome. As he gives his oath about the selection of a wife for Isaac, the servant of Abraham places his hand under Abraham's thigh. 129 An unsubstantiated statement, unsubstantiated because its realization belongs to the future, is given substantiation by being placed immediately beside the material reality of the body. The place touched by the servant is so intimate that it is almost interior to the body, and it is in oaths often the interior of the body that is exposed, usually through some form of wounding, in attempts to bestow the force of the material world on the immaterial. 130 The Arab accompanied his statement with the act of dipping his hand in the blood of a camel. The Homeric oath was taken standing on a slaughtered steed, as the Roman uttered his words, a hog was slain. Two Nag is taking a mutual oath held between them, a dog that was chopped in 2.131 Sometimes the swearer's own body is used in confirmation, as when the Zuni Indian put an arrow down his throat to show that the words emanating from his mouth had their source in the realm of material substance. 132 Or the swearer's own body might be wounded, opened, as when the seaman Nag taking an oath bit off his own forefinger. 133 What is striking about such unmediated juxtapositions, and relevant to the way in which at the end of war open bodies and verbal issues are placed side by side, is that in most instances the verbal assertion has no source of substantiation other than the body. The truth claimed in the verbal statement is remote either because, as in the oaths above, it belongs to the future or to the unwitnessed past, or because, as in the instance of the augur who locates his prophecy in the disposition of entrails, it originates in a religious realm inaccessible to the senses, or because, as in the rites of blood brothers who by opening the body and mixing their blood acquire the relationship normally acquired through the interior mechanism of biology alone, the rite itself is openly acknowledged to create rather than to confirm the truth of the verbal assertion it accompanies. Now we are brothers. The body tends to be brought forward in its most extreme and absolute form only on behalf of a cultural artifact or symbolic fragment or made thing, a sentence, that is without any other basis in material reality, that is, it is only brought forward when there is a crisis of substantiation. As a result of this unanchored quality, the disembodied cultural fragment has a fluidity not shared by its physical counterpart in war. The damage inflicted on bodies is unalterable, whereas the symbolic claims or issues change with great ease. There may, in any given war, be specific reasons why the issue is unanchored. Like an oath, its confirmation may belong to the future. The regime, once in power, will acquire the support of the people. The war, once over, will have made the world safe for democracy. Or, like augury, its claimed substantiation may originate in a metaphysical or historically inaccessible sphere. Divine sanction for a claim to the disputed land may reside in an unconsultable source, or may depend on the mystical inaccessibility of historical dialectic. Or, like the pacts of blood brothers, in which the ritual of interior blood mixing performed on one day is believed to have created a shared sameness of blood for all time thereafter, it may describe itself as a universalization of its own activity. This war is all wars and the end of this particular war is the end of all wars. Or, finally, it may be unanchored because, as has been stressed in many disparate accounts of 19th and 20th century wars, it is simply untrue. The constructs, claims, and issues may be lies. It is, in fact, the unanchoredness of even the most legitimate issues in war that makes them only with difficulty distinguishable from and therefore so easily substituted by lies. Whatever the specific causes of this unanchoredness, there is always one general cause. The dispute that leads to the war involves a process by which each side calls into question the legitimacy and thereby erodes the reality of the other country's issues, beliefs, ideas, self-conception. Dispute leads relentlessly to war not only because war is an extension and intensification of dispute but because it is a correction and reversal of it. That is, the injuring not only provides a means of choosing between disputants but also provides, by its massive opening of human bodies, a way of reconnecting the derrealized and disembodied beliefs with the force and power of the material world. In a dispute that leads to war, a belief on each side that has asterisk cultural reality for that side's population is exposed as a cultural fiction. That is, by being continually called into question, it begins to become recognizable to its own population as an invented structure rather than existing as it did in peacetime as one that, though on reflection invented, could be unself-consciously entered into as though it were a naturally occurring given of the world. As the dispute intensifies and endures, the exposed cultural fiction may seem in danger of eroding further into a cultural fraud, in danger of eroding from something that is uncomfortably recognizable as made into something potentially identifiable as unreal, untrue, illegitimate, arbitrary. The more the process of pluralization continues, the more desperately will each side work to recertify and verbally reaffirm the legitimacy and reality of its own cultural constructs. Although at a distance human beings take pride in being the single species that relentlessly recreates the world, generates fictions, and builds culture, to arrive at the recognition that one has been unself-consciously dwelling in the midst of one's own creation by witnessing the derrealization of the made thing is a terrifying and self-repudiating process. The outlines of this process are visible in any historic account of the conflict preceding a given war. It is not that a country's population actively wishes to discredit the other population's forms of belief and self-description but, rather, that their own beliefs and descriptions contradict the other populations, and thus by merely continuing to believe in and reaffirm their own constructs, they inevitably contribute to the deconstruction of the competing construct. Whatever the particular descriptions that have collided, what has always collided is each population's right to generate its own forms of self-description. Prior to World War I, for example, Germany may believe that the series of treaties between Britain, Belgium, France, and Russia are the encirclement of Germany, while these other countries may believe that it is the encirclement of France by Germany that is prevented by the treaties. France may perceive Alsace-Lorraine as a deep and abiding part of her national integrity temporarily separated from her at Versailles in 1871, while Germany may see France's yearning toward Alsace-Lorraine as territorial lust for land that has long and rightfully been part of Germany, and as a dangerous extension of French presence toward the German heartland. 134 Thus as each country reasserts its description, it denies the authenticity of its neighbor's description, and for either to revise its conception of alliance or territory is to relinquish its own autonomy of self-description, self-belief. Although all men create, what they create differs from country to country, and when the competing creations collide, the revelation that these were only creations is intolerable. No matter how deeply interior to one country an event seems to be, it will also be a very differently understood event in its neighbor's self-construction. When in some future generation, East and West Germany reunite, no one can doubt that the impulse to do so will have arisen out of the depths of Germany's own interior national consciousness, but neither can one doubt that that event, though occurring safely within her own reconstituted boundaries, will also cut very deeply into the interior national self-description of France and into that of Russia. Thus in a dispute, each side reasserts that its own constructs are real and that only the other side's constructs are creations, and by extension, fictions, lies. In certifying the reality of its own descriptions, each will bring forward and place before its opponent's eyes and, more important, the eyes of its own population, all available sources of substantiation. For example, in the 1979-80 dispute between Iran and the United States, each deeply believed not simply that its own descriptions were right and the opponents were wrong, but that its own descriptions were real and the opponents, unreal. Did not the United States protested in astonishment Iran see that the taking of hostages was self-evidently wrong, that the guarantee of an embassy's immunity has international reality? Did not Iran protested in astonishment the United States see that providing sanctuary to a man who had inflicted her on the Iranian people and who would do so again was self-evidently wrong, that the damage done to the Iranian people was real and would again be real? The answer to the United States question was no. The answer to Iran's question was no. Thus, there took place for a time a reality duel, each side attempting to bring forward more and more signs of the density, weight, scale simply, the substantiveness of its own beliefs. The counterpoint of authentication becomes self-amplifying, the United States side's international law, focusing attention on the fact that these rules have been consented to, brought into existence and invested with reality, not only by its own population, but by the population of many countries. Iran, in turn, places before international cameras the image of thousands of Iranians certifying the guilt of the Shah. Now the United States asks other countries to cite the international rules, making visible the fact that these laws were not simply once agreed to but are, despite Iran's action, at this very moment still in effect. Now in turn Iran places before the same cameras not simply Iranians but American residents in Iran and other foreign, i.e., international, residents who also bear witness to the wrongs of the ousted Shah. History is invoked to substantiate the descriptions of both sides. The United States recalls to its own population the meaning of sanctuary during revolutions. Iran recalls to its population the United States backing of the Shah in 1951 to demonstrate the legitimacy of its fear about his reimposition in the present. Neither side recites to its own people historical precedents that would provide a parallel for the opponent's self-description. The Boxer Rebellion does not often enter into the conversations of Americans, historical and prophetic evidence that religious mullahs are as capable of inflicting pain and terror in people as Western Shahs does not enter into the conversation of Iranians. Above all, the incontestable reality of the body is continuously re-invoked by both sides. 135 This man is dying of cancer. Here are the doctor's reports. Do the Iranians not believe in the reality of the body? Thousands of people were tortured by the Shah. Here are first-hand accounts and the internationally respected AC counts of Amnesty International. Do not the Americans believe in the reality of the body? The numbers support Iran's side. You are talking about one man's hurt. We are talking about the hurt of thousands. No, the numbers support the side of the United States. You are talking about rules that hold sway within your own boundaries. We are talking about rules that hold sway in all countries in the international community. A temporal perspective favors the beliefs of the Americans. You are talking about hurts inflicted in the past. We are only attending to a sickness that is happening right now. No, a temporal perspective favors the Iranians. Here are the enduringly damaged bodies of those hurt under his regime. Who will be hurt again if he, or a Western surrogate, is returned? But as each side works to authenticate its own description, it also works to devalue the opponent's description. If the history of the Shah's reign in Iran and the United States' responsibility in that history has no place in the United States self-description, then the international laws that protect the United States' power of self-description must be derealized. The hostages are taken in Iran. In turn, if the international laws have no reality, the quality of compelling authority, in Iran, then Iran must be derealized. The freezing of Iranian assets and the placing of visiting Iranian students in limbo is a way of saying Iranian money and citizens henceforth have a provisional unreality within U.S. borders. Central events are appropriated into the self-understanding of each side. Above all, the hostages belong to each side. For the United States, they are American citizens wronged in Iran. For the Iranians, they are surrogate Iranians, that is, they are Americans in Iran whose suffering the United States will attend to and who will, by an act of proxy, draw attention to the otherwise unattended to sufferings of Iranians hurt under the Shah. Thus each day in the United States the church bells ring at noon to commemorate the absent American hostages, and Ayatollah Khomeini presents a full-page Christmas message in the New York Times noting that the sound of those midday church bells commemorates all those Iranians who were hurt under the previous regime. The contest to out-describe continues. This dispute did not lead to war because each side successfully certified its own constructs while gradually also crediting those of its opponent. 136 But in the early days of conflict, many Americans confessed their readiness, even eagerness, to go to war. What is the structure of the feeling of being eager to go to war? To invoke psychological and motivational words like aggression or pride does not answer the question, but only introduces an alternative vocabulary that reoccasions the same question. The timing and context of such feelings here and in other international disputes suggest that when the system of national self-belief is without any compelling source of substantiation other than the material fact of, and intensity of feeling in, the bodies of the believers, patriots, themselves 137 then war feelings are occasioned. That is, it is when a country has become to its population a fiction that wars begin, however intensely beloved by its people that fiction is. In understanding this, it is crucial to notice the difference in the ontological status of the word country in the phrases longing for one's country and killing for one's country, in order to hold visible the fact that the object in the first phrase has an objective reality independent of the intentional state that it does not have in the second phrase. If one is away from one's homeland and misses Ireland or longs for Israel, Ireland and Israel have an independent existence apart from the longing, however much they may also be altered, enhanced or diminished by the citizen's own image of them. But they do not independently exist when one dies for Ireland or kills for Israel. If the Ireland for which one dies existed, and Ireland independent of British rule, one would not be dying. If the Israel for which one kills existed, and Israel secure within boundaries acceptable to her population and the population of her neighbors, one would not be killing. If the Britain for which one dies existed, a Britain whose territorial self-definition included the Falkland Islands, one would not be dying. If the Germany for which one kills, a Germany with an homogeneous Aryan population, a Germany internationally recognized as the dominant state in Europe, a Germany whose sense of humiliation acquired in an earlier war had been healed, one would not be killing. If the democracy for which one dies existed in a world safe for democracy, one would not be dying to make the world safe for democracy. If the country for which one kills existed in a world in which there was an end of wars, one would not be killing to make a war that ends all wars. It is to the degree that the object does not exist, or is perceived to be in danger of ceasing to exist, that the bodily alteration, asserted in dying and killing to be on behalf of that object, is occasioned and necessitated. The object is understood to be being brought into existence by the act. The Russia that one yearns for exists, the Zimbabwe that one pays taxes for exists and must be kept in place, the United States that in 1861 one dies for, a geographically and morally unified nation, does not exist. The northern boy kills because it does not exist. He brings it into being by his acts which are productive of the thing, just as the country for which the southern boy dies, one securely separate and autonomous from the north, does not exist and he brings it into being by his death. In this and every war, the enduring contest is a contest to see which one of the two not yet existing countries will be produced as an outcome. Thus the process of derealization in the dispute that leads to war is both continued in war and reversed by it. The relentless work of derealizing the competing cultural constructs is on the one hand intensified as each population actively struggles to eliminate the other's beliefs that have come into conflict with its own. It is not by eliminating, derealizing, or annihilating the opponent that one will have salvaged one's own national self-definition, but by oneself winning the contest and earning by that designation of winner the right to enact one's own constructs. Thus the first function of injury, the establishing of the categories of winner and loser, the one that can be replaced with any contest activity, continues the derealization process of dispute. But injuring, in its second function, is a reversal of dispute because injuries provide the radical material base for the winning issues, investing them with the bodily attribute of reality until there is time for both of the populations to consent to them, enact them, make them real. In the first moments and days and weeks when the war has just been declared over, the competing fictions, both the one on the losing side that is now officially unreal and the one on the winning side that is to be accepted as henceforth real, have even less reality than they did before the war started, and the sudden abrupt assertion, now one of these constellations of beliefs will be accepted as true would be a vacant absurdity, as was earlier seen when this assertion was imagined as occurring at the end of one of the benign contests, if there were not something giving it a compelling quality, not only memorializing that a process of resolution indisputably took place, but also lending those attributes of compelling reality and indisputable facticity to the outcome as well. 138 Thus the relentless end. Extraordinary physical alterations occurring in war itself are framed on either side, at its opening and at its close, by unanchored issues, issues deprived of substantiation. This framing unreality of the exterior constructs appropriates the reality of the interior content of war. The relation of inside to outside is the relation that, for example, exists in a very abbreviated form in notes between the juxtaposed extremes of the open body and the verbal assertion. Verbal unanchoredness inside war. Although it is the unanchoredness of the exterior framing issues that is of crucial importance here, it should also be recalled that all forms of language within the interior of war tend to have the same unanchored quality. The utter derealization of verbal meaning occurring there, the presence of fictions or, more drastically, lies has often been commented on. Strategy, to begin with just one major form of language interior to war, does not simply entail lies but is essentially and centrally a verbal act of lying. The goal of every strategic design is to actively withhold meaning from the opponent, as is persuasively summarized in Stonewall Jackson's strategic motto, mystify, mislead, surprise. The enemy must believe you are telling the truth when you are lying and, equally important, must believe you are lying when you are telling the truth. 139 Strategy, or military language, is a large phenomenon itself made up of many smaller parts, many of which have rubrics that actively announce their purpose of withholding meaning. Codes, for example, are attempts to make meaning irrecoverable, or, at the very least, to embed that meaning in multiple tiers of arbitrarily sequenced signs in order to divert the opponent's energies into hours of incomprehension. In camouflage, the principle of lying is carried forward into the materialized self-expression of clothing, shelter, and other structures. You wear what you wear because the enemy must think you are not there when you are there, or must believe to have seen you toward the east when you are coming from the west. Camouflage also works in language. Tags, as Liddell Hart points out, were originally christened tanks to verbally camouflage them as cisterns until their first use in World War I. What are all those things? Tags. 140. The rubric, bluffing, also makes visible the centrality of verbal fictions. In surprise or unanticipated injuring, the opponent must perceive your immediate power over them as much less than or much more distant than it actually is. Conversely, in anticipatory injuring, when one side brings about surrender without the reciprocal injuring of battle, the opponent is often made to believe that your capacity to injure is much greater than or more proximate than it actually is. The crucial place of cunning and deceit in military strategy is acknowledged throughout Clausewitz's On War 141 and Napoleon specified as the single most important act in achieving victory, the severing of the opponent's lines of communication. Thus, within war itself, the indisputably physical reality of the mounting wounds has as its verbal counterpart the mounting unreality of language. The two authentic physical content and unauthentic verbal content are such inevitable counterparts of one another that they have often been understood as near synonyms. Machiavelli continually coupled force and fraud as though they were nearly indistinguishable. 142 and Schopenhauer, 2, saw violence and lies as inseparable. 143 Thus the fact that the one is brought about by the other, that injuring requires strategy, that wounding requires lying, is not surprising. But the dissolution of language is also present within other areas of language. First, verbal alliances. Second, the verbal reports or history of the events within war. Third, the everyday conversations of the participants. The immediate circumstances surrounding the outbreak of war so routinely include secret treaties, verbal alliances between the governments of two countries known to the populations of those countries, or unknown to the government and population of a third country that most peace plans have had to include their prohibition as a major provision. Kant's treatise on international government, Perpetual Peace, opens with Article I, the stipulation that no secret reservations could be included in treaties. Bentham's plan for peace prohibited secret diplomacy. St. Pierre's banned treaties formed without the consent of the Union. The 14 points preceding the League of Nations also called for the prohibition of secret treaties. 144 Similar provisions exist within the covenants drawn up by the Fabian Society, the victory program of the League to ensure peace, the Union of Democratic Control in England, and the Dutch Anti-War Council. 145 So, 2. The architects of covenants such as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty have had to so assume the possibility of the deconstruction of the covenant through lying that a provision has had to be designed to preclude that possibility. A. Confirmation provision stipulating ways of certifying that a country's claims about its weapons are true. 146 The recurring presence of prohibitions against secrets, withheld meaning, fictions, lies in all these covenants attempting to maximize the possibility of peace suggests how central to war is the licensing of these phenomena. As fictiveness becomes a major attribute of language which precedes physical injury, the instrumental language of strategy and alliance that brings the wounding into being, so too it becomes a major attribute of language which follows the injury, the language reporting the history of the scenes that took place that day. The habitual discrepancy between the sheer facticity of dead bodies and the fictiveness of body counts is familiar from every recent war. So, too, descriptive accounts of the outcome and significance of a particular engagement are often submerged in obscurity. Though Stalingrad was early recognized as a turning point in World War II, the deliberate falsification on both sides had been so deep that any coherent description was for a time irrecoverable. 147 So, too, it was for a while almost an act of treason for anyone in Japan's navy to discuss the outcome of Midway. 148 The surrender of the Italian fleet, whose location and timing were determined by the Italian naval authorities, was mythologized on the Allied side as having been directly authored by the Allied radio broadcasts. 149 The fate 6F British troops at Dunkirk was until the 1970s described as though it were perfectly appropriate and conventional to understand the act of moving away from the opponent as military heroism. 150 Eisenhower's house-by-house movement through the Ruhr Valley at the end of World War II, repeatedly cited in the United States as brilliant strategy, was perceived as an incomprehensible delay by an alarmed British military command as well as by a pleased German military command. 151 Thus in any battle, campaign, or war, more men may be lost than are recorded as lost. A near draw or even a retreat may be remembered as a victory. A defeat may be reinterpreted as a diversionary tactic. 152 And unconditional surrender may be renamed honorable capitulation. 153 As the nature of any specific engagement may be misrepresented, so there may come to exist general structures of explanation or historical interpretation that are fictitious. The great man paradigm of military history pervasive during the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century era not wholly absent in the 20th century has, for example, been described at length as a systematic fiction in Tolstoy's Essays on War. 154 The three categories of language thus of strategy, alliance, history may wrongly suggest that only official language becomes unanchored, but the dissolution radiates in all directions and enters the everyday life of civilians at home and soldiers on the front. Freud, in his Reflections upon War and Death, attends to the massive depression of the population at home, and attributes it in part to the sudden sanctioning of lies. 155 So, 2. The ordinary soldier as in the portrait provided in Mark Bloch's Memoirs of War dwells every day in the midst of determinate wounds and indeterminate meaning. It is not just every fragment of language but every sound, every noise that is at once resonant with meaning and wholly indeterminate in meaning. The innocent tap-tap of the raindrops on the foliage may instead be the rhythm of distant footsteps, the metallic scraping sound of very dry leaves falling on the leaf-strewn forest floor is repeatedly mistaken for the click of an automatic loader introduced into a German rifle breech. 156 As the soldier surveys the incontestable bullet holes in his canteen, a colonel rides by and announces a French victory. The soldier swoons with elation. Only later does he realize that the words he has heard do not have the same substance as the pain in his arm, that he did not at that moment really know the distance or direction of the German soldiers whose presumed absence so elated him. 15 Language becomes increasingly severed from material substance and, as Bloch argues in Les Fausses Nouvelles de la Guerre, tall tales, false reports, rumors, and legends begin to fill the soldier's speech, especially as small groups of men on the move pass and speak for a few minutes with other small groups of men on the move. 158 Like the language of strategy, alliance, and history, the language of daily conversation is not necessarily false. For that would mean it had more clarity than it has. With each sentence one hears, the possibilities are completely open. Each verbal utterance has at all times the explosive duality of being at once very possibly true and very possibly false, and of course there will be many moments in which the accuracy of the guess as to its truth or falsity will determine whether one lives or dies. If the fluidity of language interior to war were described not in terms of the speaker as it implicitly is in the categories used here of strategy, alliance, history, and daily conversation but instead in terms of content or subject matter, the list of contents would be very long. What would have come to be unrepresented or misrepresented would include the motives of individuals, of governments, of armies, the direction and location of thousands of men, the location and scale of one's injuring power, submarines drop beneath the visible surface of the water, tanks mine the stodgy innocence of cisterns, guns branch forth as part of the foliage, and missiles flow to hidden locations as though they were only birds carried on the wind, the disposition of events within battles, the bodily fate of large populations of soldiers. But of all disappearing content, the most crucial is the one this chapter opened with, the disappearance of the injuries themselves from all spheres of language, whether strategic, historical, or conversational. The radical unanchoredness of the language of war is in nothing so visible as in its separation from that phenomenon, the alteration of hands, heart, lungs, brain, that is, in the midst of so much fluctuativeness, not only the most indisputably and unalterably real phenomenon but also the phenomenon that is with massive, obsessive, dogged repetitiveness being brought into being often hundreds of times each day, day after day. The eventual transfer of the attributes of injuries to a victorious national fiction requires as prelude the severing of those attributes from their original source, an act of severing and disowning that has a wide, perhaps collective, authorship. Of primary importance to the analysis here is the unanchoredness of the framing issues of war, and the relation of that unanchored verbal frame to the relentless physical content of bodily alteration in war's interior. But it is also relevant to witness and understand for a moment the relation between the unanchoredness of the framing issues and the dissolution of verbal coherence and meaning within war. The language in war's interior aspires to the condition of the framing language. The fictions occurring inside war may be as they traditionally are understood in the context of immediate motive and need. 1. A strategist deconstructs the bodies of opponents by first separating those opponents from the human community of shared verbal meaning. Another, a government leader, misrepresents those events that occurred in the battle because ensuring the continued participation of the population requires exiling that same population from mental participation in what has just occurred. Another, a soldier, repeats a wholly false tale of enemy atrocity, or alternatively fails to repeat a wholly true tale of enemy atrocity, because he is now moving gun in hand across a terrain that has been emptied of all substantive speech. But however accurate it is to describe these events in terms of their local motives, they should also collectively be seen within the overall occurrence, the overarching frame of what war is. War is in the massive fact of itself a huge structure for the duralization of cultural constructs and, simultaneously, for their eventual reconstitution. The purpose of the war is to designate as an outcome which of the two competing cultural constructs will by both sides be allowed to become real, which of the two will, after the war, hold sway in the shared space where the two, prior to war, collided. Thus, the declaration of war is the declaration that reality is now officially up for grabs, is now officially not only to be suspended but systematically deconstructed, a deconstruction that will be carried far enough on both sides so that either one, if designated the loser, will have less difficulty reimagining itself as without its disputed aspect of self-definition than it would immediately prior to the war. The lies, fictions, falsification, within war, though authored by particular kinds of speakers in any given instance, government officials, journalists, generals, soldiers, factory workers, themselves together collectively objectify and extend the formal fact of what war is, the suspension of the reality of constructs, the systematic retraction of all benign forms of substance from the artifacts of civilization, and simultaneously, the mining of the ultimate substance, the ultimate source of substantiation, the extraction of the physical basis of reality from its dark hiding place in the body out into the light of day, the making available of the precious ore of confirmation, the interior content of human bodies, lungs, arteries, blood, brains, the mother lode that will eventually be reconnected to the winning issue, to which it will lend its radical substance, its compelling, heart-sickening reality, until benign forms of substantiation come into being. Thus in war injuring performs two distinct functions. It serves as a basis for a contest, a means that has no advantage over other means of arriving at a winner and a loser. Second, it provides a source of substantiation for the issue's designated winner as a result of the first function. Because these two profoundly different functions are embedded in a single act, they are usually indistinguishable. At most, injuring is perceived to perform the first function of determining a winner, and sometimes, the referential instability at work in the second, rather than alerting the observer to the presence of that second function, instead brings about the retroactive disappearance of even the first function. Thus injury comes to be understood as functionless as in all those descriptions that designated a useless byproduct PR accidental outcome of war. Only when the two very different functions are literally assigned a separate space as they were in Hitler's Germany, where injuring as contest could be understood as residing in the external space of confrontation with allied countries, and injuring as substantiation as residing in the internal space of concentration camps is the structure of war. Exposed. This double space is not exclusive to Germany. The wars in the Middle East, Vietnam, Korea, for example, sometimes entailed an external space of battle and an internal space of torturing imprisoned soldiers, and much more crucially, even when the two are occurring in the singular space of external conflict, a very similar, though not identical 159, second use of the human body is always occurring there. That is, the collective casualties of World War II, the hurt bodies of Allied soldiers, Allied civilians, Axis soldiers, Axis EI civilians, neutral civilians all contribute to the memorialization function, objectifying the process that just occurred, or they as it function, certifying the reality of the not yet enacted disposition of winning issues, and would do so whether, as is the case, victory belonged to the Allied powers or, instead, to the Axis powers. This by no means means that the issues on ch2 sides are the same, for there may be, as there was, an expanse of justice that separates them, but it does mean that the substantiation process itself, the collective work of the bodies injured in the external space of conflict, is the same regardless of what it substantiates, is the same whether what it substantiates is a construct suffused with beauty and justice or one containing the very antitheses of these attributes. Had the American South won the Civil War, what was substantiated would have been radically different from what, through the victory of the North, was instead substantiated, but the war's contribution to the substantiation process would have been in the two cases identical. So, for example, the American Revolutionary War substantiated the right of secession, the American Civil War substantiated the right of the Union to prevent secession. The conflation of the two functions increases our confusion about and reliance on injuring. If the two were disentwined and replaced by stylized and rationalized versions of themselves, each would require a very different form of substitute. First, a comparatively benign means of arriving at a winner and a loser would be carried out, one that whether based on talent or instead luck would be of great duration and intricacy. It could never be a toss of the coin, though it could conceivably be an extraordinarily prolonged and elaborate procedure of forming, forging, weighing, and tossing massive numbers of coins in complicated mathematical combinations in order to engage over time a depth of attention consonant with the depth of imaginative reorientation eventually required of the loser. Second, as the week approached for the final and decisive series of acts, people of the disputing countries and of countries in any way affected by the outcome would not only begin to wear or enact agreed upon signs objectifying that such a contest took place, the memorialization component of the substantiation function, but would also, to fulfill the as if component of the substantiating function, by prearrangement now gather in large groups throughout their homelands, and at the end, multitudes of individuals would each hold up or simply hold onto an animal organ or intral in confirmation of the idea of winning and of the issue that was the winner and henceforth real. This second form of substitution, though introduced here only for the purpose of structural clarification, is, of course, ghastly to contemplate. There would no doubt be a universally shared species shame at picturing ourselves engaged in so atavistic, so primitive a ritual. But however primitive such a surrogate would be, seeming in that hour to carry us back thousands of years, it would be one very large step closer to the benign and familiar forms of substantiation in civilization that is the fiction-generating process now relied on in war. That is, in almost all arenas of human creation, the work of substantiation originally accomplished by the interior of the human body has undergone 100 stages of transformation, but the first step was the substitution of the human body with an animal body. War is one of the few structures for the derivation and reconstitution of constructs in which this very first form of substitution has never occurred. Thus, the inner voice that protests that the imagined ritual would carry us back thousands of years must be reminded that war carries us back those thousands plus one. The torture and one a difference between them. Thus war, like torture, is, in its second function, a structure through which the attributes of the her body are connected to unanchored verbal constructs. What within torture happens between two people, the body of a prisoner deprived of his voice, and the verbal constructs of the interrogating torturer, himself disembodied through his immunity to pain, is a phenomenon of transfer in war happening on a now vast scale, between the collective casualties and collective national constructs. The two are structural analogues. Like torture, war claims pain's attributes as its own and disclaims the pain itself. There is, however, a crucial element that differentiates the substantiating function in the two events and partially explains why war has a moral ambiguity torture simply does not have. Before looking at that differentiating element, it is useful to recall that the fact that torture and war are different is, of course, visible outside the particular vocabulary and structural analysis provided here. Although there has never been an intelligent argument on behalf of torture, and such an argument is a conceptual impossibility 160, there have been many on behalf of war. Such arguments fall into at least three categories. First, defense is widely held to be a justifiable basis for entering a war that has already been started against one's own country. A long philosophic tradition identifies the very basis of political legitimacy as self-help, the ability to defend oneself. 161 This principle was explicitly assumed, for example, by the architects of the United States, as is visible throughout the Federalist Papers. 162 However, even if by war one means not just retaliation but initiation, not just defending oneself once attacked but also oneself beginning the attack, at least two additional categories of argument are, if never wholly persuasive, not wholly unpersuasive. The first of these tends to be psychological in its vocabulary, though it is sometimes individual, sometimes class, and sometimes national psychology that is being described. As the psychological argument evolves through each of these spheres, it becomes successively more difficult to assess, either to confirm or discredit. So, individuals who refuse to go to war may be described by advocates of war as motivated by cowardice. On this individual level, the argument seems less an argument than an arbitrary accusation. It is not very persuasive, since it is so clear that the courage needed to refuse participation may be as great as what is required to enter war. Those who went to Vietnam and those who stayed home in protest were substantiating two different conceptions of a nation, as well as using two different forms of substantiation. Once, however, the framework changes to class, the same argument takes a much more provocative and potentially compelling form. Carl Schmitt's 1928 essay, on the concept of the political, includes an analysis of the pacifist impulse as class privilege. He takes Hegel to mean by the word bourgeois the word pacifist. A bourgeois is an individual who does not want to leave the apolitical riskless private sphere, one who believes his property exempts him from conflicts which will, despite his absence, nevertheless take place. 163 The psychological argument, dismissible in its individual form, less dismissible in its class form. 164 is perhaps least dismissible in its national form, where it tends to be sidestepped by opponents rather than argued against. The explanatory framework carried through the term Scandinavization is one in which the desirable national traits of neutrality and pacifism are read as signs of the negative national traits they are asserted to accompany. Hence, the demise of self-belief, the exhaustion of a conception of nationhood, property self-exemption from conflict and from self-renewal. The two major categories of argument attended to so far both implicitly AC knowledge war as a fiction-generating, or construct substantiating process, even though they do not worry that it is the most atavistic form of creation. That is, the defense argument, the equation of political legitimacy or sovereignty with self-help, can be rephrased as the capacity of a people to substantiate, to first make and make real its own beliefs, its own territorial and ideological self-definition. So, too, as the psychological argument is lifted out of the individual idiom of cowardice and carried through the class idiom of self-exemption to the national idiom of exhaustion, it becomes clear that what is all along being called into question is the capacity for self-renewal or self-recreation, that it is not so much moral attributes but the attributes required for creation that are at issue. Tocqueville, for example, argued that the intellectual creativity of a population and its readiness to go to war are related. A reluctance to war or to revolution arising from the condition of equality is accompanied by a reluctance to any revolution in ideas and to the suppression of individual genius. Genius will either not arise within those boundaries or will, if it should arise, fail to be recognized. 165 So, too, it has often been noticed that artistic creation frequently occurs in conjunction with an absorption with military matters both in the realm of the individual artist. Leonardo da Vinci is the most familiar example. 166 And in the realm of the nation state, the history of changing national supremacy in art, belonging now to one country, now to another, tends to follow the same path as the history of changing political supremacy. 167 So, too, major studies of the history of technology, such as those by Siegfried Gideon, Louis Mumford, and William McNeill 168 all demonstrate the technological inventiveness occasioned by war. This point will be returned to after looking at the third major form of argument on behalf of war. This third form is an unself-referring argument about justice. It is not the argument that justice is an attribute of the ideology on behalf of which one fights. My country's cause is just, but, rather, The argument that justice as an attribute of the international realm, the whole earth, is only present there if that international realm includes the possibility of going to war. That is, what is about to be described here should not be confused with the claim that a particular country's entering war has justice, for it is instead a much less specific and much more radical claim that the world that has permanent peace is less just than one in which peace can be interrupted by war. Clausewitz observed that it is always the most powerful country that is peace-loving, the disposition of issues and boundaries perpetuated by the reigning peace overwhelmingly favor that country. Thus it is the less powerful country, what in some descriptions is called the continental challenger, that conceives of itself either as directly suppressed by the other country or, perhaps equally drastically, as having a potential for change and growth that is indirectly suppressed by the present disposition of power held in place by the reigning peace. Nothing can be learned about the validity of this argument from its invocation by specific leaders or countries. That Lenin, for example, loved this passage in Clausewitz 169 only shows that the insight may be useful to those who wish to go to war rather than that it is true. Its possible validity is, however, suggested by architects of various peace plans who, originally motivated by the passion to rid the world of war, have sometimes concluded that a world emptied of war may be an unjust world. Outlawing war altogether would be, even if possible, possibly morally undesirable because what had up to that moment been a world characterized by fluidity of boundaries, trade arrangements, markets, ideological patterns would suddenly be frozen, and frozen in a way that favored certain sets of people over certain others. So, although some peace plans, for example, Bentham's, Kant's, have required the absolute abolition of standing armies, others, such as that of the Fabian Society, explicitly include a provision that allows countries, after waiting a period of time, to go to war. 170 as one moves from general, and unself-interested, peace plans to specific peace treaties. Between sets of countries, so routine is the inclusion of exception clauses, so routine is the guarding of the privilege of going to war, that it has been argued that such treaties, far from minimizing the possibility of war, instead specify the next occasion of war, they in effect become predictive models or architectural maps of the next war. 171 is their form of argument, like the first two, again seems to assume that what is at stake in the question of war is a fiction-generating capacity. Here, however, it is not so much national self-recreation but, in effect, terrestrial recreation that is being guarded. Central to this argument is the awareness that the overall configuration of political, territorial, and cultural constructs across the entire Earth is in a constant condition of being reinvented, remade, and that war the contest to out-injure is crucial in this process. Whether or not any of the three forms of argument on behalf of war has validity is too complicated a question to answer here. What is instead crucial to see is that even if they were valid, they would not have shown the necessity of war, but instead would only have shown the necessity of a contest based on a reciprocal activity that would produce a non-reciprocal outcome abided by all. 172 that is, even if the self-recreation of a country, continent, or world as a whole requires a process that allows the periodic virilization of cultural constructs and simultaneously permits their reconstitution by providing forms of substantiation until they can be fully realized, the fiction-generating process need not itself stay frozen in its most elementary form, or, but can potentially itself be derealized and replaced by a reconstituted version of itself. It is precisely because the capacity for invention and self-recreation is so universally held to be precious that the most legitimately seductive arguments on behalf of war are arguments, in different guises, that war contributes to the recreation process. But in turn the universally shared recognition of the importance of invention ultimately signals the importance of subjecting the substantiation process itself, or, to the same process of recreation. The surrogate for war would be in the international realm the mechanism for ensuring the possibility of periodic change that is the equivalent within the nation-state to the mechanism of elections which ensures the fluidity of constructs interior to national boundaries. Perhaps instead of the next war, the disputing countries could agree to a contest in which each invents a surrogate for war, one that accommodates all war's structural attributes. The country offering the best substitute would win that international contest, though what it had gained, the issues made real as a result, might well themselves a few generations later be derealized when, in its turn, the country had to enter the process of dispute resolution it had earlier invented. At any rate, however hypothetical, and thus itself anchored, not yet true, is the idea of a substitute. For war, evidence that such reinvention is possible is present in the overwhelming fact that civilization has, in areas other than war, repeatedly managed to displace the earliest form of substantiation with forms equally compelling but much more benign. The reinvention of the substantiation process is the subject of the second half of this book. But before turning to that subject, we must return to the original point of this final section, the articulation of the element that differentiates the structure of torture from the structure of war. Even if war were never replaced by a substitute, it should be recognized that it is not the equivalent of torture. This is, perhaps, intuitively obvious. No one conceives of soldiers as torturers or of the collective activity as having the absolute moral onus of torture, even though the number and permanence of injuries, as well as the amount of suffering prior to death, are much greater in wars than in torture. The critical difference between torture and war should be articulated, not as an apology for war, but for these three reasons. 1. The more accurately the nature of war is described, the more likely the chances that it will one day be displaced by a structural surrogate. 2. Insofar as war is already in a state of continuous reinvention, it will always either be progressing in the direction of the benign model of substantiation found in civilization or instead degenerating into a more radical deconstruction, the absolute model for which is torture. 3. Once war and torture are differentiated, it will become clear that nuclear war is closer to the model of torture than it is to the model of conventional war. In both war and torture, the normal relation between body and voice is deconstructed and replaced by one in which the extremes of the hurt body and unanchored verbal assertions, pain and interrogation in torture, casualties and verbal issues in war, are laid edge to edge. In each, a fiction is produced, a fiction that is a projected image of the body. The pain's reality is now the regime's reality. The factualness of corpses is now the factualness of an ideology or territorial self-definition. But the nature of the fictiveness is in the two very different. This difference does not depend on the content of the fiction, for that content, if considered apart from the human hurt used to confirm it, may itself, in both war and torture, be either good or bad, itself just or unjust. The issue of war might be human equality or instead slavery. Again, if one tortures to certify the reality of Christ, as in the Inquisition, the fact that the idea of Christ is itself a benign and beautiful construct does not change the fact that this is precisely the same event as torturing for the intrinsically ugly construct of Aryan supremacy. That the distinction between the fictiveness of torture and the fictiveness of war is independent of the content of the fiction is most easily illustrated by the fact that the two forms of substantiation can occur on behalf of the same construct. Substantiating a state constitution through war would be different from substantiating that same constitution through torture, even though the content of the thing substantiated is the same. 173 The difference in the fictiveness of the two is much larger than is signaled by using the negative idiom of fraud to refer to the one and the neutral or equivocal idiom of fiction to refer to the other, and turns on the fact that though the constructs of both are deprived of benign sources of substantiation, one is fundamentally untrue while the other is not yet true. That is, one requires the substantiating power of the her body precisely because it does not have consent, while the other has both populations consent but time is required for them to enact their consent. It may at first appear that the substantiating function in war has only one half of the collective population's consent, since the casualties of the losing side confirm outcomes antithetical to their original beliefs, but all participants of both sides, though fighting for different issues, have consented to contribute their bodies to a process which assumes at its very beginning the non-reciprocity of outcome, contains from its opening moments the certainty that only one side's issues will in the end be declared real, and it is the work of every soldier to push forward to this concluding inequality. Thus it is deeply inaccurate to say that in entering war, they agree to substantiate their own and no other's issues. By the very act of entering war, they have agreed to certify if not their own, then the other side's issues. After a period has elapsed, they will more actively and specifically assent. After the American War of Independence, the population of England comes not only to accept but even to applaud the United States Act of Secession. After the American Civil War, the population of the South comes not only to accept but to take pride in its presence within the larger Union, not only accepts but takes pride in the dissolution of slavery from its territory. The prisoner of torture has at no time consented to contribute his body to the fiction of the regime's power produced through his pain. The mime of power in torture is for fictitious in that it is unreal, while the winning issues in war are fictitious in that they are not yet real. In one case fiction means a lie about reality while in the other, fiction means an anticipation of reality. The relation of torture and war is clearer if placed within the overall framework of the difference between substantiation in its extreme deconstruction, torture, on the one hand and substantiation in civilization on the other, for war hovers somewhere between the two. As has been suggested earlier 174 and as will be elaborated at some length in later chapters, in benign forms of creation, a bodily attribute is projected into the artifact, a fiction, a made thing, which essentially takes over the work of the body, thereby freeing the embodied person of discomfort and thus enabling him to enter a larger realm of self-extension. The chair, for example, mimes the spine, takes over its work, freeing the person of the constant distress of moving through many small body postures, empties his mind of absorption with the pain in his back, enabling him instead to attend to the clay bowl he is making or to listen to the conversation of a friend. In torture, the opposite takes place. Rather than relieve the body of discomfort, extreme pain is inflicted. Rather than enabling the person's movement out of the boundaries of the body into the shared realm of extension, it instead brings about a continual contraction and collapse of the contents of world consciousness. Rather than making objects that relieve pain, it deconstructs already existing objects in order to inflict pain. It at once reverses and itself apes the benign process of imaginative making. For ch6 pain becomes the intermediate artifact, the produce bodily condition whose attributes are themselves projected out onto and become attributes of the regime's power. If these two radically antithetical events are taken as models for the structure of creation on the one hand and as the deconstruction of the structure of creation on the other, then it is clear that war belongs on the same ground as torture. For here, too, what is produced is physical distress and bodily alteration rather than an artifact that eliminates pain. War requires the contraction of the contents of world consciousness, as the pre-one's mind is filled with bodily pain, so the soldier's mind is obsessively filled with the bodily events of dying and killing. It also requires that attributes of i.e. her body be separated from the body and projected onto constructs.